And just to give you a little framework for my talk, given the broad mission of this colloquium series, what I decided to do was tell you a little bit about implicit prejudice as a construct, citing some of my work, but also work of other people, and then dive in a little bit to the research that goes on in my lab in particular. Okay. All right, so we can go ahead and get started. I forgot the third and most important thing. Thank you so much for having me. I really appreciate it. It's been a wonderful visit so far. And yes.
Can you use the mic?
Okay, well, see, Jermaine, you were falling down on your job. All right. Okay. All right, is that better? All right, okay. I will try and be good. Ma'am, what was your name? Lee. Okay, Jermaine's fired. You're in charge of sound now. All right. So thank you so much for having me. Okay. All right, so let's get started. So I always put up my thank you slides first because by the end of the talk, I'm so tired of hearing myself talk that I sometimes forget the thank you slides. So I'd like to begin by thanking Adriana Kendrick and Drew Jacoby Senhor, whose dissertation research is prominently featured in this talk, as well as Jeff Hunsinger, Janetta Lunn, and Janine Skrinko, who are former students of mine who contributed to the work I'll present as well. All good things that I talk about are from them. All mistakes that I may make during the talk are my own. Okay. And as I mentioned, the plan for today is just to make the case for the construct of implicit prejudice in particular, and then try and give you a bird's eye sense of the research that's going on in my lab. And then lastly, touch on why, at least I like to think that the work is important, and also speak to a little bit about where we're going. All right. So implicit prejudice. Social psychologists, I'm a social psychologist, and we make a distinction between what we call implicit and explicit prejudice. So explicit prejudice is conscious, it's deliberative, it's experienced as chosen, it's usually captured via self-report. So if it was the case that I asked you, how do you feel about particular ethnic groups, how do you feel about particular gender groups, age groups, and you reported to me, I kind of like that group of people, I think this group of people is a particular way, all of those would be your explicit attitudes, right? The things you know that you think, that you're willing and able to articulate that you think. Okay. Implicit prejudice is thought to be less conscious, so you may have an inkling or you might have no idea what your implicit attitudes are. Implicit prejudice would be your implicit attitudes towards particular groups. It's spontaneous, meaning the thinking in this literature is that your implicit attitudes, your implicit prejudice, come to mind right away as soon as you see a member of that target group. Okay. And it's thought to be a function basically of long-term socialization. There's actually some debate about that emerging, but I think the working assumption is that these are associations sort of in your head that are a product of being a member of society where media representations are biased, your life exposure is potentially biased as well. And right, if it's relatively unconscious, you can't just ask people what their implicit prejudice is, and so we tend to look at it indirectly, oftentimes using response latency measures that are borrowed from cognitive psychology. And I'm going to give you, first of all, just a subjective sense of implicit prejudice and how we measure it. Okay. And so we're going to play a game. Okay. This is my demonstration version of a task that we frequently use in our lab. It's called the implicit association task. And what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to start at the top of the circle, and I'd like you to hit your left knee if you see an African-American, what appears to be an African-American face. I'd like you to hit your right knee if you see what appears to be a white American face. I'd like you to start at the top of the clock and go around as quickly and accurately as you can. Go. Loud and proud. Okay. Okay. All right, we got to remember they're trying to record, right? So we've got to do this a little louder. All right, it's going to get a little more complicated now. So I'd like you to tap your left leg if you see what appears to be an African American face or an unpleasant word. Nasty, for example, is an unpleasant word. I'd like you to tap your right leg if you see what appears to be a white American face and a pleasant word. So, for example, beauty would be a pleasant word. Again, start at the top of the clock and go around clockwise as quickly and accurately as you can. Go. Okay. Hey, it's okay. You're a little uncoordinated, but you were loud, so we're good. We're okay. All right. All right, we're going to switch things up. So I'd like you this time to tap your left leg, if you see what appears to be a white American face, and tap your right leg if you see what appears to be an African American face. Top of the clock, around as quickly and accurately as you can. Go. All right. And now we're going to do combined categories again. So left leg, if you see what appears to be a white American face or an unpleasant word. Right leg, if you see what appears to be an African American face or a pleasant word. Top of the clock, around, go. So, did you notice something that was different between this task and this task? Were you better at the first one or the second one? Right. It took a little bit longer for the second one. There were more giggles, right, for the second one. So first of all, I want to tell you, I have literally done this demonstration now for probably hundreds, if not thousands of people, and there was only one instance in which it didn't turn out exactly the way that it did in this room. Okay? And the thinking from the perspective of people who study implicit prejudice, right, so they do a computer-based, very controlled version of this task, but the basic idea is that on average, it is easier for people to associate white and pleasant, even if it's just with your leg, than it is for them to associate African American and pleasant. Okay? And to the extent people show this difference in association, the more you show this effect, the more you're thought to be implicitly prejudiced. Okay? So when I do this demonstration, people often have a lot of questions about it. So just to make sure we're on the same page and you maybe even sort of buy the premise of implicit prejudice, do you have any questions for me about the measure itself, about the demonstration you just did? Yes?
One of the things I noticed for myself is as I got around the circle, it wasn't so easy to remember what I was actually doing. Mm-hmm. So I found myself tapping for the wrong image, for the wrong word. So could you say something about how you... I assume it's not just me.
No.
So how do you account for that?
Got it. Well, so from our perspective, right, the interesting thing would be is if you got more confused in the second trials than in the first trials, because what we care about is the difference in your speed between those two, right? So to the extent, you got confused similarly across both trials, then taking the different score accounts for that. Oftentimes people will ask about the order. So they'll say, oh, well, by the second time, I was tired or I was confused, and that's why I made more mistakes. And so I give the demonstration in the way that gets the biggest effect. But if I gave it to you the other way around, which I have done in demonstrations before, you still get the effect. It might be a little bit smaller. And then what people will say when it's the other way around is, oh, well, I got practice at the task, and so it got easier over time. Okay. Anything else? Yes?
Could you say something very briefly about the one time that the findings didn't? You said there was one time when it didn't work out the way it usually works out.
That one time I did this for sort of a special gathering of Princeton alum who came, who were sort of big donors. Probably shouldn't say that on the thing, but oh well. Who came to Princeton to support African American studies. And so they were sort of a very unusual group of people, and it was a predominantly African American audience. And so, I think there was something about the characteristics of that sample. But I've done it for undergraduates, I've done it for professors, I've done it for community members, and in every other instance, it comes out like this. Okay. Yes?
Is there any connection to left-handed versus right-handedness?
That's actually a great question. People have asked that, and so in the computer version, the official version of this task, they will switch around the task so that your handedness can account for the effects across participants. Anything else? Okay, all right. So this, again, is called the implicit association task. I gave you the race-based one. There is a website called the Project Implicit website, and you can take an implicit association task for almost anything. So I encourage you, if you're bored one day, to go to this website. You can get your implicit associations for liberals versus conservatives. You can get white versus black children. You can get sort of things that capture feminism, just a variety of things. And this website, literally millions of people have gone to it. And fortunately for us, the people who run it have analyzed the responses of people who have come to the website to check out their implicit attitudes. So for this construct to be meaningful, it is useful to know if it's prevalent, right? And how this prevalence is shaped by things like the demographic characteristics of the people who come to the site. So first of all, implicit bias is prevalent. So at the time they did this accounting of the people who came to the website, about 2 million people had come at that point. And you'll see about 70% of the people who came to the website had some degree of pro-white, anti-black bias. They also were more pro-young, anti-old, pro-straight, anti-gay, and pro-able-bodied, anti-disabled. Okay. So the vast majority of people have some degree of bias. If you focusing specifically on the pro-white, anti-black measure that we did the demonstration of, if you look at people from around the world, the size of the effect is about the same. So these were the regions that they had the largest representation of. A lot of people want to know what happens when you focus on the specific ethnic categories of the people taking this measure. And basically what you'll see is the size of the effect goes down as you sort of go down the American status hierarchy. Okay? With African Americans not showing pro-black bias, but not showing pro-white bias either on average. And to give you a sense just of the effect size of implicit versus explicit prejudice, the red bars are the size of people's implicit bias, and the blue bars are the size of their explicit biases, so what they are willing to say about various groups. Okay. And you can see, right, that in general, we get bigger effects on implicit measures than explicit. Okay. And as I proceed, I want to encourage you as we go to ask questions. So I am more than happy to answer questions. I actually prefer to answer questions, and I will graciously shut you down if you steal the show. So you don't have to worry about that. Okay. Yeah.
On the previous slide,
yes.
The categories at the bottom.
Yes.
Can you just explain those a little bit?
Oh, please. Yeah, it's funny because I wanted to walk over and do it, but I'm not allowed to move. Which I will yell and try and do. So this is the one that we did the demonstration for. So this is pro-white, anti-black, positive and negative words with adult faces. This is the same exact task, except they used faces of children. And this is the same exact task, except they used, I think it was weapons versus tools. And so African Americans are more strongly associated with weapons relative to tools. Yes?
In the previous slide, you used distinguish between Europe and UK? Are you ahead of the election in June? Or
No.
Reasoning behind separating?
So right. So first answer is I'm reporting the results of Brian Nosek and colleagues' work, but I know why they broke it down this way. So this is a voluntary website, which is interesting, right? Given the size of the effects and the prevalence of the bias, these are people who cared enough to come to a website to test their biases, and it just so happens that in terms of the visitors around the world, these were the groupings that allowed for data analysis. So they have lots of people from the UK, but then they just put everybody else in Europe in a group so they could analyze that. Okay. Anything else? Yes.
Yes, I mean, I guess the patterns that you found, I mean, they seem very plausible to me, but one kind of concern that I would have about this sort of test is that I think, like if I were taking this and I kind of wanted to get a certain result and I tried, I could probably get that result.
No. That's actually, so this measure in social psychology actually inspired a ton of controversy, and so more so than I think many other measures, it's gone through sort of analyses of things like handedness and validity checks, and one of the things they've done is they will tell people how it works and say, okay, now subvert the measure, and people can't do it. It is the case that with enough internal motivation and practice, people can make the effect smaller. So there is some degree of control in this measure, but not enough really to subvert its validity entirely. Okay. Anything else? And it's part of the reason I do the demonstration, because I think people, they giggle, right? I think they feel like they know how they want to respond, and they start laughing because they also feel like they can't. Okay. This particular measure has that sort of visceral quality to it that others don't. Okay. Anything else? All right. Okay. And so, right, one thing that's important if I'm going to make the case for this construct is that it's prevalent. Another thing that we want to consider is whether it's meaningful. And here are some areas in which people have demonstrated the predictive validity, so the meaningfulness of this kind of measure. Most of the research is on the quality and quantity of cross-race contact. So the higher higher whites are in implicit prejudice, the less comfortable they report feeling interacting with African Americans, the fewer African Americans they report having as friends. If you put them in a room with an African American person, they will sit a little bit farther away, they'll just seem a little more uncomfortable. And also, after the interaction, they'll just be more mentally exhausted, presumably from regulating the anxiety. Okay. There's some interesting work in the medical decision-making arena, which I'm not going to talk about in the interest of time, but I did decide to talk a little bit, given this particular audience, about political decision-making and academic outcomes. Okay. So there are a few studies that look at implicit prejudice and voting. This is my favorite. This is work by Eric Knowles and colleagues. And basically what they did, this is a nationally representative sample, and they were looking at voting for Obama in the 2008 election. So they measured people's anti-Black implicit prejudice. I take this back. So there are other studies that look for voting for Obama. This one looked at people's evaluations of his health care reform plans. So they measured people's implicit anti-Black bias, they measured people's attitudes towards Obama, and they measured support for his reform plans. Okay. So the higher people were, in implicit bias, the less supportive they were of Obama's reform plans, but it turns out this was accounted for by their negative attitudes towards Obama. So the more biased they were, the less they liked Obama, the less they liked his health care plan. Okay. Now the reason, though this is my favorite paper, is because they followed this up with an experiment in which they took a description of the very same healthcare plan, and they described it as originating from Clinton or originating from Obama. Okay. For those of you who are very young and cloistered, Clinton is white. Okay. And what you see here, right, is implicit prejudice here, positive attitudes towards the policy. The higher whites were in implicit bias, the less they liked the policy, but only if it was framed as originating from Obama. There was no relationship, even though it was the same policy, it was framed as originating from Clinton. Okay. And also, to give you context, this was Bill Clinton. In terms of academics, this is a paper that Drew Jacoby Senghor, myself, and Nicole Shelton, who's in my department, worked on, where we were interested in whether teachers' implicit biases might affect the outcomes of their students. And so we began by looking at this with a lab analog. So we brought students into the lab, and we brought white students and black students into the lab. The white students were always assigned to teacher, and they had to teach a novel piece of historical information to either a white peer or a black peer. Okay. We measured everyone's implicit bias. The students had time to prepare the lesson. They gave the lesson, which we videotaped, and then the people who were assigned to the role of students took a test on the material. Okay. And what you see here is the test score on the test of the material. So the more biased the person assigned to the role of teacher was, the less well African American learners did on this subsequent test. But there was no relationship for white learners. Okay. And after that, right, we videotaped the lesson because we wanted to see exactly what was creating this difference. And what we found was that when objective raters rated the videotapes, they found that the higher teachers were in implicit bias, the more anxious they seemed, and also the poorer the lesson quality. So the lessons were just less clear. So while implicit bias predicted learner test score, it was because of effectively the quality of the lesson. They were anxious, they're so busy sort of regulating their anxiety that they just can't teach as well. And so the African American learner does less well. And I don't have the slides for that, but just to bring it home, we did a second experiment where we gave these original lessons to a subsequent group of non-black students. And what you find is the non-black students perform exactly the same way as the black students did because the variance is not in the students, the variance is in the quality of the lesson. Also, Vandenberg and colleagues, so these are Dutch researchers who looked at this in the context of intergroup relations in the Netherlands. So in the Netherlands, low status groups are Moroccans. And here they took real teachers at the beginning of the year. They measured their native Dutch versus anti-Moroccan bias. And then they looked at the test scores of the students at the end of the year. So the more biased the teachers were, the less well the Moroccan students did on their end of the year math test. And actually, the native Dutch students did slightly better as a function of the teacher's bias. And this was also the case for the end of the year verbal scores of the Moroccan students. There was no relationship, no positive relationship for the native Dutch students. Okay. All right. So, yes?
Going back,
Yes.
the teacher, the anxiety of the teacher,
Mm-hmm.
was there some way to ensure that the anxiety was just due to the racial composition of the class and not to just anxiety about teaching or
That's a great question. So this one, so just to be careful, just be very circumspect about the data. This is a lab analog, so these were just people who came into the lab. So right now we're trying to look at what happens in sort of real schools in the U.S. Here it's a white Princeton student teaching a white or a black Princeton student a new piece of material. And the reason we know the anxiety, well, we suspect the anxiety has something to do with the implicit prejudice is because they show more anxiety when they're teaching the black peer versus the white peer, and it's that difference in anxiety that's having its effect.
Okay.
Okay. Anything else? Yes?
Did you have any black instructors?
No. We have some interesting hypotheses for what would happen when you manipulate the ethnicity of the instructor. But given the demographics of public school teachers are predominantly white, we're beginning there, and then we'll branch out over time and to the extent we can get schools to participate. Yes?
In the Dutch study,
Yes.
is there any way to, is there any way to also measure, like the Moroccan students, I assume the language that's being taught in Dutch, and
Mm-hmm.
is there any way to measure, like, if they're Moroccan immigrants who just arrived, who don't have Dutch language very well? I mean, is that a factor?
Yeah, no, so all I can do is report what they reported, and they don't really get into a lot of the specifics of the population. I mean, what I think they would answer is that the students' sort of ability to sort of learn in Dutch shouldn't necessarily be related to the biases of the teachers, unless there was some artifact where high bias teachers happen to be assigned to students who weren't particularly fluent in native Dutch. Yes?
Were the test scores done empirically?
Yes. So these were objective scores that they just, from I think actually meaningful exams in the Netherlands at the end of the year. Okay. Anything else? And in our lab analog as well. So we had them take a test, and the test was a combination, basically a short answer exam, and we had separate objective people grade the exams. All right. So perhaps I convinced you that there might be a thing called implicit prejudice, and that it's might be prevalent and might be meaningful. And so what do we do with it, right, in our lab? Okay. And in our lab, I'm going to talk to you about two things. So first, I'm going to talk to you about this idea of contagion. So first, we will go through a set of experiments in which we think about the ways in which we're primarily focused on whites here, so whites can kind of catch the egalitarian attitudes of those around them. And then we'll talk about connection. So is it also the case that whites are attracted to people who seem to have similar levels of implicit bias? Okay. And all of my work is animated by this perspective called shared reality theory. And shared reality theory basically argues that people are motivated to achieve a sense of shared reality with others. So basically, you want to see the world the same way as the individuals around you. And to the extent you achieve that moment within an interaction where you feel like you see the world the same way, that draws you closer to that person, and it also makes you feel more confident with respect to your attitudes. And because of this theoretical focus, right, the importance of sharing reality, I'm going to just be documenting as we go along the importance of similarity in our findings. Okay, so contagion. So if we take this shared reality notion seriously, it makes this following prediction. So when people want to get along with someone, their beliefs will adjust to match the apparent beliefs of that person, and this is because their goal is to achieve a sense of shared reality, right? If shared reality makes you feel bonded to someone, if you want to bond with someone, one way you can do that is adjust to fit them. And the way we've done this in the lab is using this experimenter paradigm. So participants come into the lab, they meet an experimenter who's wearing a shirt. So it's a shirt with an anti-racism message or a neutral message. So this was an actual RA of mine a few years ago, actually many years ago now. And this is the example of the kind of shirt we use in our lab. So they'll have a plain black shirt and then a shirt that says racism. So over time, it's a little bit funny that now I have to specifically say it's not e-racism, like e-commerce. It's not like electronic racism, right? So it's supposed to be sort of erase racism. Okay. All right, and then in a variety of ways across experiments. So I'm a big believer in the importance of replication. So everything I've shown you, we've done it lots of different ways. And in particular, we'll manipulate affiliative motivation, so how much you want to get along with the person, lots of different ways. I'm going to just show you an experiment, which is from my favorite manipulation of affiliative motivation. We have the experimenter behave in a rude way or a friendly way. And so what they do in this version of the experiment is they come into the lab, they see a giant bowl of candy, and the experimenter will either say, oh, have some candy, take as much as you want. We're really grateful for you coming in and helping us out with this study. Okay. Or participants will come in, they'll see this giant bowl of candy, and the experimenter will say something along the lines of, oh, well, you can take that bowl of candy and just move it out of the way. Some of the other people in the lab like to give their participants candy, but frankly, I think you're lucky to get experimental credit. Yes, is great. And one of the things other reasons that this is my favorite experiment is because this was an student's honors thesis, and she got really disturbingly good at delivering this manipulation. But to make you feel comfortable about the design, she wasn't the only one doing the study. So we've had experimenters who are blind to condition. Okay. All right, so the experimenter, you know what the experimenter values. The experimenter's friendly or rude, and then we give people a measure of implicit prejudice. So in this particular experiment, we used a subliminal priming measure of implicit prejudice just to give you a sense of what that's like. It's because it's a little different than the IET. People will sit down at a computer, they'll see this, opening a screen, press the space bar, and basically they're told that you're going to see a dot. At some point in the corner of the screen, there's going to be a sunflower. Ignore the sunflower. Okay, there. Okay, let's see, go back, all right. Ignore the sunflower, and I want you to hit one key if you see the word good and another key if you see the word bad. What participants don't know is that sunflower is masking images of whites or blacks that are presented really quickly. They're presented so quickly that people aren't aware with the forward and backward mask that they've seen a black or white face, but their visual system can pick up the fact that they've seen a black or white face. And what you find is the thinking is the faster you are to recognize the word good after being flashed with a white face versus how quickly you are to recognize the word bad after being flashed with a black face, right? So the more you have that tendency, the higher you are in implicit prejudice. And so what do we find? Right. If we look here at the likable condition, when the experimenter is likable, this is automatic anti-black, pro-white bias, and the experimenter is wearing this anti-racism shirt. Implicit prejudice is lower than when the experimenter is wearing a neutral shirt. Okay. When the experimenter is rude, because these bars don't overlap, or because these bars overlap, there's no difference here. Okay. And right, one of the things that's interesting about this is, participants, right, because it was subliminal, they had no idea that we were measuring their prejudice. We've done versions of this study where we tell them it's a prejudice measure and they don't know what we're talking about, and then we've done versions of this study where we don't say anything. Okay. And so as I mentioned, I'm a sucker for replication, and we've done this lots of different ways. So we've looked at it across culture. So if you take people from interdependent cultures, they'll show this effect without having to have the extra push of affiliative motivation compared to people from independent cultures. We've primed affiliative motivation with sentence and scrambling tasks or various other subtle ways of getting people to want to get along versus not. We've also measured it, so how much do you just like the experimenter? And we've done this with implicit prejudice, but just to give you comfort in the sort of robustness of the effect, we've also shown this on lots of other outcomes, including self-views and mood. Now, we're turning to Adriana's dissertation. For this to be sort of maximally interesting, you want people's prejudice, right, to adjust to the interpersonal context, but you also want it to be maintained, right? So if you are interacting with a nice experimenter wearing a racism t-shirt, it's super that your unconscious prejudice, you become more egalitarian unconsciously in that moment. But can we also take that moment and extend it over time? Okay. And her thinking was that you could, to the extent people experience shared reality, to the extent they feel like in that moment, they and the experimenter are seeing the world the same way, that this is going to solidify their newly, relatively more egalitarian thinking. And so what we do is, or what she did, is she set up a study, right, where it's an experimenter in an anti-racism shirt, and we get affiliated motivation to be high. So this is a situation in which you should get reduced implicit bias. And she used a subliminal measure of implicit prejudice again. Okay. But she added this part. So she did everything that we normally do, including giving them a measure of implicit prejudice, and then after the subliminal priming prejudice measure was finished, she had the experimenter sort of come around to the computer and write down some random number that we had come up on the screen that was completely meaningless, and sort of be very official about it, and then make the offhand comment. These attitude measures are pretty cool. Some people score really differently from each other, but your attitudes are really similar to mine, or your attitudes are really different from mine. Right? So you've got this person wearing a racism t-shirt, and they're saying, we share reality on prejudice, even though they have no idea how we measured it. Or, we don't share reality, but whatever, that's cool. Okay. Then she has people take the implicit prejudice measure again, right? It's subliminal, so they can just take it again, right? Because they have no ability to control their responses. And also she has them interact with a separate African American person in what's ostensibly an unrelated study. Okay. Now here, this is the first measure of implicit prejudice. It all goes down, right? Because they're engaged in what we were calling social tuning, the effect I showed you before. What's important here is that after that manipulation, it stays down when you share reality with the experimenter, but when the experimenter says, we're different, we don't share reality, it pops back up again. Okay. And in the interest of time, I won't I'll tell you this finding. So they go on to what they think is an unrelated study. They have an interaction with a Black Confederate who's blind to condition, and the person whose newly egalitarian views were shared with the experimenter, suddenly they're interacting with the additional Black person in a way that's more pleasant than the person who didn't achieve shared reality. So the thinking is they're more egalitarian. It's showing up in the implicit measures, but also it's showing up in their behavior to the next Black person that they meet. Now, in the interest of time, I won't show you her super cool additional study, the take-home message is she was very brave and looked at this over a lapse of 2 weeks. So rather than have the subsequent interracial interaction occur right after, she brought people back 2 weeks after, and we get the same findings. Now, contagion. So this is contagion. So maybe people's implicit prejudice, whites in particular, adjust to the interpersonal context, even though they don't know that they're biased. And this can be maintained possibly over time. So also, is it the case that people's implicit prejudice, people meaning whites, implicit prejudice, can shape the interactions that they choose? Okay. And also, again, to share reality. So the reasons to expect this to be the case, there's a big literature in social psychology that says, right, similarity breeds liking. We like people who are like us. Okay. Right? But there are lots of reasons to expect this not to be the case. So I just argued that implicit attitudes are relatively unconscious. So I'm basically arguing that people, whites, are drawn together based on something that they don't really know about themselves. Okay. And even if that was true, right, being ethnically biased is counter-normative. So I'm also arguing that they're being drawn together based on something they don't really know about themselves, and according to at least societal standards, they don't really like about themselves. Okay. The other sort of little tricky thing is that what would be the signal between whites that someone has similar implicit bias? And for that, we used friendship. So basically, we're arguing that whites, to the extent they're highly biased, look out at a sea of whites. If to the extent they see a white person who has a black friend, if you're biased, you're going to be less likely to want to be friends with that white person who has the black friend than a white person you see that has a white friend. Okay. And the way we do this is we measure people's implicit prejudice. We do it using a slightly different IET, so specifically these effects are going to be driven by people's implicit associations towards blacks. In the paradigm I'll show you in a second, we manipulate whether people think a black and white person paired together are friends or strangers. And then we just have them report how much they think they're going to like the target. So this is the paradigm. It's very simple. They're just looking at these headshots. Right? Sometimes the pairs are opposite or white and black. Sometimes they're both white people. There are also a bunch of distractors, so people don't really have a sense that what we care about is the race of the friend. We tell them arbitrarily they've been assigned to the left condition. The left condition person, the target person is always white, and it's the ethnicity of the person on the right that's changing. So they're not even, from our perspective, they're not even being told to pay attention to this person on this side here. And then we ask them, how much do you think you're going to want to get along with this person? So they think this study is about first impressions. We also ask them, how fearful do you think this person is? Or how fearful does this person make you feel? Do you think you could predict this person's behaviors? And how similar do you think you are to this person? Right? So there are lots of potential reasons people who are whites who are high in bias could not like a white person who has a black friend, and we try and get at all of them. Our favorite is this one. Okay. What do we find? So here, higher numbers mean you prefer the white person with the black friend over the white person with the white friend. And the higher white perceivers are an implicit bias, the less they like another white person, to the extent that person has a black friend versus a white friend. But when you think the people are just standing next to each other, implicit bias doesn't affect liking, right? So it's really about that friendship, sort of saying, oh, that person is friends with a black person. That means something, and how my attitudes are going to shape how I feel about that person. We looked at all those potential explanations, and the only one that popped out was actually similarity. So the more biased whites were, the less similar they felt to a white person who had a black friend versus a white friend. And this slope is actually in the opposite direction, though it's not significant. Okay? So they're looking at that person, right? They're saying, I like them or don't like them, And it turns out it's because of perceived similarity. So the more biased they are, the more they're saying, I don't think I'm quite like that person, and so I don't think I'm really going to like them. Okay. And we've done this lots of different ways. In the interest of time, I'm not going to go through this study, but one of the ways we've tried to just get more subtle about it is instead of looking at friendship, we've just looked at interracial interactions and the quality of them. So we had people look at these short, I think they're 30-second videos of interactions that were coded as positive or negative. So this is the opening shot of this interaction. So here's the African American Confederate. And this is a participant, and she seems to be having an okay time with the African American person. So this would be a comfortable video. I feel badly for this poor woman, right? You can see she just looks like a deer in the headlights, poor girl, right? So this would be coded as an uncomfortable interaction. And really quickly, the higher whites are an implicit bias, the less they like the person who seems comfortable with the African American person. Okay, so I'm going to do this quickly. But I have to show this study because, again, this is Drew's dissertation, and he did this thing, and that I was like, sure, go ahead and do it. I don't think it's going to work, but it did, where he wanted to see if this affected actual friendships, right? And so by actual friendships, I mean Facebook friends, so you can have a debate about whether those are actual friendships or not. There is a literature suggesting that people are real-life friends with their Facebook friends, but I'm not on Facebook, so I can't tell you. I have a Facebook account. If you try and friend me, I won't respond to you because the only reason I have it is I need to see what they look like in order to mentor him through this study. But anyway, so we looked at this on Facebook. In particular, I'm just going to give you a heads up that we were interested in the gender in a way that didn't come up in the previous studies. So in the previous studies, gender never moderated the effects. But if you look at the literature on gender and friendship, it actually turns out that women's friendships are thought to be based more on similarity than men's friendships. So when I taught psychology of gender, we would say that women's friendships are face-to-face. Women are talking a lot, so it's important that they have similar values, while men's friendships tend to be side-to-side, right? So they're doing activities together, and so shared values just aren't as relevant. So here was a very simple study. We brought people into the lab. We gave them a different subliminal measure of implicit prejudice. And then we sent them, we noted a few things about them, including their gender, and then we just sent them home. And we had a research assistant stalk them on Facebook. Okay. And we didn't tell them that we were going to do this. We only used public Facebook accounts because we didn't want people to go back and sort of control the friendship network that they were representing on Facebook. At the time, Facebook was organized like this, and they had this list of your top 10 friends. Okay, and so what our research assistant did was she looked up our participants, she looked at their top 10 friends, and then she clicked on each of these people, and she looked at their top 10 friends. Right? So our hypothesis is the more biased people are, we don't necessarily have predictions for their first order friends, but they should have fewer friends with African American friends, right? Because in theory, if we put our effect out into the world, maybe when it was time to meet that person possibly was walking around with that African American friend, and they were less likely to go, that seems like my person. Or maybe that person sent out a friend request, and you see their African American friends on Facebook, and you think, that's not quite my kind of person. And that's exactly what we find, but we only find it for women. So the more biased women are, the less likely they are to have a friend with an African American friend. But there's no effect for men. So again, speaking possibly to the importance of similarity. Okay. So we went through contagion, we went through connection. I will zoom past that and just quickly tell you why I think these things are important. So one answer is that our work suggests an interesting mechanism for prejudice reduction. So most of the research on prejudice reduction, particularly the research on implicit prejudice reduction, relies on effort. So I said at the beginning, if you're internally motivated and you're really trying, maybe you can reduce your implicit prejudice. Or there's a robust literature suggesting interracial contact reduces prejudice. But our strategy is a way to reduce prejudice that doesn't require effort on the part of people who experience prejudice, right? They don't have to engage in intergroup contact, and they don't have to do it in a special, counter-stereotypic way for this to be effective. This is a way for sort of whites to change the attitudes of other whites without requiring ethnic minorities sort of to participate in the cure for the problems that they suffer from. Okay. And also, if you take my grouping of contagion and contact seriously, I chose those words because in the sociology literature, those are thought to be mechanisms by which our social networks become homogeneous. So this is a picture of a social network, and you'll see the blue dots are kind of together, right? And the yellow dots are kind of together. And this is actually smiling in a Facebook network. So the yellow dots represent people who are smiling in Facebook. And the blue dots represent people who are relatively blue, right? So they're not really smiling in Facebook. And this is argued to occur because of a combination of contagion and connection. And so what if it's the case that our social networks also might be more homogeneous, but based on our implicit prejudice as well? Okay. So there are reasons that I've talked about, as well as reasons I didn't talk about, that might be the case. And if that is the case, right, it has implications for whites. As their social networks become more homogeneous, their biases or their pre-existing attitudes might become more extreme. Also, people who are egalitarian, if you're in a biased network, might get pushed to the outside of that network. And then for African Americans, think about, implicit biases are non-conscious. You can get assigned to, or maybe even explicitly welcomed into the wrong social network, where every single person is just a little weird around you. And to the extent that that's the case, that could have implications for people's mental and physical health, as well as their sense of belonging as they get pushed to the edge of the network. And so that was my plan for today. Hopefully it was remotely interesting. And thank you.